The grinding sound of my diamond wire saw cutting through Georgia marble filled the garage that early October morning, drowning out everything except the satisfaction of watching another perfect slice fall away. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and I could smell that clean, mineral scent that only comes from fresh-cut stone. What I didn't know was that less than 50 feet away, Celine Harrison was probably cursing my name while counting stacks of dirty money in her basement, wondering how long it would be before my hobby brought the wrong kind of attention to our pristine little neighborhood. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me ask you something first. Have you ever had that one thing that keeps you sane? That one activity that pulls you back from the edge when your job involves staring at crime scenes all day, analyzing blood spatter patterns, and trying to piece together the final moments of someone's life? Drop a comment and tell me what that thing is for you, because I want to know if anyone else out there understands what it's like to need something pure and creative after spending 12 hours surrounded by humanity's darkest moments. My name is Ryan Cavallari, and for the past 8 years, I've been a senior criminalist with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. 37 years old, divorced, living in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Reserve that I probably couldn't afford if it weren't for the 30 grand a year I make selling sculptures to galleries and private collectors. People always seem surprised when they find out I work in forensics and sculpt stone in my spare time. Like somehow those two things don't go together. But here's what they don't understand. When you spend your days analyzing the worst things people do to each other, when you're the guy who has to swab blood samples and photograph knife wounds and testify about how many times someone was beaten before they died, you need something that lets you create instead of just documenting destruction. I discovered stone carving 3 years after my daughter Emma died. She was 8 when the leukemia took her, and losing her pretty much destroyed everything good in my life. My marriage to Sarah didn't survive, not because we didn't love each other, but because we couldn't figure out how to exist in the same space with all that grief between us. The department gave me time off, got me into counseling, did all the right things. But what really saved me was the day I walked into a community college art class and picked up a chisel for the first time. There's something about stone that demands respect. You can't rush it, can't force it, can't take your anger out on it without destroying what you're trying to create. It taught me patience again when I thought I'd lost that forever. Every piece I make has a small heart carved somewhere hidden, sometimes in the base, sometimes worked into the design so subtly you'd never notice unless you knew to look. That's for Emma. She used to draw these elaborate hearts on everything when she was little, and now she's part of every sculpture I create. The neighbors in my old apartment complex didn't mind the noise. Most of them worked construction or factory jobs, understood what it meant to work with your hands. But after the divorce was finalized, I decided I needed a fresh start somewhere quiet. Willow Creek Reserve seemed perfect, a newer development full of doctors and bank executives who appreciated art, with HOA rules that kept everything looking pristine and property values climbing steadily. The realtor mentioned the HOA when I signed the papers, but it was just standard stuff about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. Nothing about restrictions on home workshops or noise ordinances beyond the usual no loud activities after 10 p.m. rule. I specifically asked about my sculpting, showed her pictures of my setup, explained about the equipment. She assured me it wouldn't be a problem as long as I kept reasonable hours. I should have gotten that in writing. The house came with a 3-car garage, which was perfect because I only needed one space for my truck. The other 2 bays became my studio. Industrial ventilation system, rubber mats to absorb vibration, professional lighting, and about $40,000 worth of stone cutting equipment that I'd accumulated over the years. For the first 6 months, everything was perfect. I'd get home from analyzing crime scenes, change out of my suit into work clothes, and lose myself in the rhythm of cutting and shaping come a stone. The work was meditative, almost therapeutic. Turn on some music, fire up the wet saw, and let muscle memory take over while my mind finally had permission to stop replaying the day's horrors. My neighbors seemed to appreciate having an artist in the neighborhood. Dr. Peterson from next door would stop by sometimes to watch me work, fascinated by the process. The Johnsons across the street commissioned a bird bath for their garden, even got a write-up in the neighborhood newsletter about local artisan Ryan Cavallari and his stunning marble sculptures. That's when I should have realized I was painting a target on my back. See, what I didn't know at the time was that our HOA secretary-treasurer, Celine Harrison, had some very specific reasons for wanting a quiet neighborhood where nobody paid too much attention to unusual sounds or activities. And my diamond wire saws, pneumatic chisels, and angle grinders were starting to interfere with her very lucrative side business. Celine Harrison looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone who'd spent 15 years as a mid-level bank manager before volunteering to handle the HOA's finances. Perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more than most people's car payments. Designer clothes that screamed, "I have money, but I'm still relatable." and this way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. She lived in the biggest house on Magnolia Court, a sprawling Tudor-style place with a circular driveway and landscaping that belonged in a magazine. Husband was some kind of consultant who traveled constantly. 2 teenage kids who went to private school and seemed to barely know their parents existed. What made Celine dangerous wasn't that she was obviously corrupt. Hell, in my line of work, I can usually spot the dirty ones from a mile away. What made her dangerous was that she was smart, careful, and had spent enough time in banking to understand exactly how financial crimes worked and how to avoid getting caught. The first time I really interacted with her was at a neighborhood barbecue about 8 months after I moved in. She cornered me by the beer cooler, all smiles and southern charm, asking about my interesting hobby. "I just think it's so wonderful that you're pursuing your passion," she said, in that voice that sounded supportive but somehow felt like she was studying me. Though I have to imagine that equipment must be quite expensive to maintain. The way she said it made my cop instincts ping, like she was fishing for information about my finances, trying to figure out if I could afford to keep doing what I was doing if it suddenly became more expensive. "I do all right," I told her. "The sculptures sell well enough to cover the costs." Her smile got a little sharper. "Of course they do, though I hope you're properly reporting that income. The IRS can be so particular about side businesses." That's when I knew I was dealing with someone who saw threats everywhere and planned to eliminate them before they became problems. But I figured as long as I followed the rules and kept reasonable hours, what could she possibly do? Man, I was naive. The first shot fired in what would become an 8-month war came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was getting ready to leave for work when I found the certified letter in my mailbox. Official HOA letterhead, Celine's signature at the bottom, and language that would make a lawyer proud. "Dear Mr. Cavallari," it began, "it has come to the attention of the Willow Creek Reserve Homeowners Association Board of Directors that you are operating industrial equipment within your residential property in violation of Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines, which specifically prohibits commercial or industrial activities within the neighborhood. They were claiming my stone-cutting equipment constituted industrial machinery, and that selling my sculptures made my garage a commercial workshop that violated the residential zoning. I had 21 days to remove all equipment and cease all sculpting activities, or face daily fines starting at $250. I read that letter 3 times before the full impact hit me. They weren't just trying to shut down my hobby, they were trying to take away the one thing that kept me functional in a job that involved staring at humanity's worst impulses every single day. The letter was professionally written, cited specific HOA guidelines, and included copies of complaints from anonymous neighbors about noise, dust, and inappropriate use of residential property. 3 complaints all filed within the past week, all describing my activities in suspiciously similar language. Here's what I found interesting from a forensic perspective, and this is something most people don't know about document analysis. When multiple complaints are written by the same person trying to disguise their handwriting, they tend to use similar vocabulary and sentence structure even when they're trying to sound different. All 3 complaints used phrases like industrial-grade equipment and commercial enterprise and diminished property values. Amateur hour stuff, really. If Celine was going to frame me, she could have at least gotten some actual neighbors to write the complaints instead of doing it all herself. But being right about the fraud didn't make the legal threat any less real. HOA rules might be bullshit, but they're legally binding bullshit when you sign that contract. And Celine had enough financial backing to drag me through court until I either gave up or went broke trying to fight. I spent that evening reading through every page of the original HOA agreement, looking for loopholes or exceptions. The restrictions were vague enough to be interpreted however the board wanted, and specific enough to give them plenty of ammunition if they decided to push. My first instinct was to lawyer up immediately. Call Sarah's attorney friend, who'd handled our divorce, get a professional opinion on whether I had grounds to fight. But lawyers are expensive, and I was already stretching my budget to afford the mortgage in Willow Creek Reserve. A prolonged legal battle could easily cost more than my house was worth, so I decided to try the reasonable approach first. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe if I explained the situation, provided evidence that I wasn't actually running a commercial business, showed that I was keeping reasonable hours and not disturbing anyone, we could work something out. I should have known better. When you're dealing with someone who sees you as a threat to their criminal enterprise, reason isn't really on the table. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community center. I marked my calendar, prepared a presentation with photos of my setup, documentation of the hours I worked, testimonials from neighbors who'd never complained, and proof that I wasn't operating a commercial business, just selling occasional pieces to cover my costs. Thursday evening came, and I walked into that community center feeling optimistic, maybe even a little smug. I had facts on my side, evidence, and a reasonable solution that should satisfy everyone. The meeting room was smaller than I expected, with about 15 people scattered across folding chairs facing a long table where the 5 board members sat. Celine was in the center seat, flanked by 2 other women and 2 men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She called the meeting to order with the kind of efficiency that reminded me why she'd been successful in banking. Quick approval of previous minutes, discussion of upcoming landscaping projects, review of monthly financials. Everything moving along smoothly until we reached new business. "We have a compliance issue to address," Celine announced, looking directly at me. "Mr. Cavallari has been operating industrial equipment in his residential garage in violation of community guidelines." She made it sound like I was running a methamphetamine lab instead of carving sculptures. The other board members nodded along like they'd already made up their minds, which they probably had. I stood up when she offered me a chance to respond, kept my voice calm and professional, and presented my case. Explained that stone sculpting was an art form, not industrial manufacturing. Showed photos of my work, described the therapeutic value, mentioned the positive coverage in the neighborhood newsletter. "The issue isn't the artistic merit," Celine interrupted before I was halfway through. "The issue is that you're using industrial equipment to run a commercial enterprise from your home. We have noise complaints, dust complaints, and concerns about decreased property values." "I'd like to see those complaints," I said, "and I'd like to know which specific neighbors are concerned so I can address their issues directly." Her smile went cold. "HOA policy protects the privacy of residents who file complaints, but I can assure you the concerns are legitimate and well documented." One of the other board members, a guy named Williams who lived near the neighborhood entrance, looked uncomfortable. "Has anyone actually tried talking to Mr. Cavallari about potential compromises? Modified hours? Sound dampening? That sort of thing?" Celine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To most people, it probably looked like she was just maintaining professional composure. To someone who'd spent 8 years studying micro-expressions and body language to determine when suspects were lying, it was as obvious as a neon sign. She didn't want to compromise. She wanted me gone. "The guidelines are clear," she said. "Residential properties are for residential use. We can't make exceptions without setting a precedent that undermines the entire community agreement." The vote was 4-1 against allowing me to continue sculpting. Williams was the only dissent, and he looked apologetic when he caught my eye afterward. The other 3 board members seemed like they were just following Celine's lead, probably didn't even understand the real issues involved. I had until April 15th to remove all equipment and cease all activities. Daily fines of $250 would begin April 16th if I wasn't in compliance. Walking back to my house that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Emma's diagnosis. That sick feeling when you realize the system you thought would protect you has decided you're expendable. But here's the thing about working in forensic investigation for 8 years. You learn that the truth usually comes out eventually. You just have to be patient enough to find it and smart enough to recognize it when you see it. And I was starting to get very curious about exactly why Celine Harrison was so determined to shut down some stone cutting equipment that nobody else in the neighborhood seemed to have a problem with. The next phase of Celine's campaign started exactly 1 week after the board meeting. I came home from work to find a citation from the city's code enforcement office tucked into my front door, claiming someone had reported industrial activities at my address. The inspector wanted to schedule a visit to evaluate whether my equipment required commercial permits. Failure to cooperate could result in immediate shutdown orders and additional fines. The citation was dated the day after the HOA meeting. Coincidence? Not fucking likely. Here's something most people don't realize about local government bureaucracy. It's actually pretty hard to get code enforcement to pay attention to a complaint unless you know exactly who to call and what buttons to push. Random neighbor complaints usually get filed and forgotten. But if you have connections, if you know the right language to use, if you can make it sound like a public safety issue, suddenly you're dealing with inspectors and permits and shutdown orders. Celine had clearly done this before. The code enforcement inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. I took a half day off work, spent the morning organizing my shop and preparing documentation to show that everything I was doing fell well within residential guidelines. The inspector turned out to be a tired-looking guy named Rodriguez who seemed genuinely apologetic about having to be there. He spent about 20 minutes looking at my setup, taking photos, checking that I had proper ventilation and safety equipment. "Honestly," he told me while filling out his report, "this is one of the cleanest hobby shops I've ever seen. Whoever complained made it sound like you were running some kind of factory operation." "Any idea who filed the complaint?" He checked his clipboard. "Says here it was anonymous, but someone provided very detailed information about specific equipment and activities. Usually anonymous complaints are pretty vague." Another red flag. Anonymous complaints with specific technical details usually meant someone had been doing surveillance or had inside information they shouldn't have had. Rodriguez's final report cleared me of any code violations, but the damage was already done. The inspection process had cost me a day of work, and Celine had successfully demonstrated that she could bring government pressure to bear whenever she wanted. More importantly, she'd established a paper trail that made me look like a problem resident who required official intervention. Future complaints would be taken more seriously because there was already a file with my name on it. The woman was playing chess while I was playing checkers. A week later, I got a call at work from Dr. Peterson, my next-door neighbor. He sounded nervous, almost apologetic. "Ryan, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Someone from the HOA stopped by yesterday asking questions about your workshop." "What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know about noise levels, what hours you typically work, whether I'd noticed any unusual activity. They also asked whether I thought your equipment could be damaging foundations or affecting property values." I could hear the concern in his voice. Peterson was a good neighbor, but he was also a doctor, with a practice to protect and a family to think about. The last thing he needed was to get dragged into a conflict with the HOA over my hobby. "What did you tell them?" "The truth, that you're quiet, respectful, keep reasonable hours, and your work is actually quite impressive." "But Ryan, they seemed like they were looking for specific answers, if you know what I mean." I knew exactly what he meant. Celine was building a case, collecting statements that could be used to justify whatever she was planning next, and she was being smart about it, approaching neighbors directly instead of going through official channels, making it seem like concerned community outreach instead of harassment. Over the next 2 weeks, I heard similar stories from 3 other neighbors. Always the same pattern, someone from the HOA asking leading questions about my activities, expressing concern about property values, wondering if people felt safe with industrial equipment in a residential area. The Johnsons, who'd commissioned the birdbath, were particularly shaken. Celine had shown up at their door with printed photos of commercial stone-cutting operations, asking if they realized that's what was happening right across the street from them. "She made it sound like you were doing something dangerous," Mrs. Johnson told me, "like we should be worried about accidents or explosions or something." Fear was Celine's weapon of choice, and she was wielding it expertly. Take something benign, like stone sculpting. Describe it in ominous terms. Show people worst-case scenarios and let their imaginations fill in the blanks. Pretty soon, neighbors who'd never had a problem with me were wondering if maybe I was a threat they just hadn't recognized yet. But here's where Celine made her first real mistake. She got greedy. Instead of just building a case for shutting down my workshop, she decided to go after my finances as well. Mid-April, I received a letter from the IRS requesting documentation for all income from sculpture sales over the past 3 years. The letter referenced an anonymous tip about unreported business income and requested bank statements, sales receipts, and detailed records of all transactions related to my sculpting activities. I had 60 days to provide the documentation or face a full audit. Now, I'm scrupulous about reporting my art income. Have to be when you work in law enforcement. Every sale gets documented, every expense gets receipted, every tax obligation gets met exactly on time. An IRS review would be inconvenient, but it wouldn't find any problems. What bothered me was the timing and the language in the letter. It referenced specific sales amounts and dates that weren't public information. Someone had provided the IRS with detailed intelligence about my activities, the kind of information you'd only have if you were conducting surveillance or had access to records you shouldn't have. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, trying to piece together the pattern. HOA complaint, city inspection, neighbor interviews, IRS investigation. All of it targeting me from different angles, all of it coordinated to create maximum pressure and expense. Celine wasn't just trying to shut down my workshop. She was trying to destroy my ability to fight back by hitting me legally, financially, and socially all at the same time. But why? What made my stone-cutting equipment such a threat that she was willing to risk this level of exposure to get rid of it? I'd been thinking about this all wrong. This wasn't about HOA rules or property values or neighbor complaints. This was about something specific to my activities that created a problem for Celine personally. The sound. It had to be the sound. My workshop was about 50 feet from her house, separated by a privacy fence and some landscaping. During the day, when I was running the wet saw or pneumatic chisels, the noise would definitely carry. But it wasn't that loud, and I kept reasonable hours. Unless there was something happening in her house that required absolute quiet. Something she couldn't afford to have neighbors overhearing. Something that my stone-cutting equipment was interfering with. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I was onto something. But I needed more information, and I needed it without making Celine suspicious that I was investigating her. Here's something they don't teach you in criminalist training, but you learn pretty quickly on the job. The best evidence usually comes from sources that don't know they're providing evidence. People are terrible at hiding their activities, but they're very good at not realizing what they're revealing. I started paying attention to patterns around Celine's house. Not obvious surveillance, I'm not an idiot, but casual observation during my normal routines. Walking my dog, checking the mail, working in my yard. What I noticed was interesting. Celine had an unusual number of maintenance appointments. Landscaping trucks, cleaning services, home repair companies. Nothing suspicious by itself, but the frequency was odd for a house that already looked perfect. More interesting was the timing. These service calls almost always happened during the day when most neighbors were at work, and they rarely seemed to actually do much work. Trucks would arrive, people would go into the house, maybe move some equipment around, then leave after an hour or two. And here's the detail that really caught my attention. Several of these service vehicles had license plates from out of state. North Carolina doesn't require business vehicles to use local plates, but it's unusual for routine maintenance to come from companies based in Florida or Tennessee. I started taking photos, not of Celine directly, that would be harassment, but of license plates and company names on vehicles visiting her property. Just casual pictures while I was walking around the neighborhood, the kind of thing anyone might do. What I found when I ran those plates through the database at work was very interesting indeed. 3 of the vehicles belonged to companies that didn't exist. The license numbers were valid, but the businesses listed as owners had been dissolved or had no record of operation. 2 others were registered to companies with addresses that turned out to be vacant lots or closed storefronts. In my line of work, fake service companies are usually involved in one of 3 things: money laundering, drug distribution, or both. And given Celine's background in banking, I was starting to develop some theories about which one we were dealing with. But theories don't hold up in court. I needed evidence, and getting that evidence without overstepping legal boundaries was going to require some creativity. Then I caught a break that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning in early May, and I was in my garage mixing a batch of polishing compound when I heard my wet saw make a sound I'd never heard before, a high-pitched screech that meant something was seriously wrong with the blade assembly. I shut everything down and started troubleshooting, which meant removing the diamond blade and checking for warping or damage. The blade looked fine, but there was something stuck in the assembly that looked like metal filings. Here's where my forensic training kicked in. Metal contamination in a diamond blade assembly doesn't happen by accident. Someone had either thrown something metallic near my saw, or there were metal particles in the air that had gotten caught in the equipment. I collected a sample of the metal filings and took them to work on Monday. Ran them through our spectrometer to determine composition and origin. The results were fascinating. The metal particles were primarily copper and zinc, consistent with brass, mixed with traces of chemicals used in currency production. The kind of residue you'd find if someone was removing serial numbers from bills or using chemical processes to treat large quantities of cash. And the concentration suggested the source was close by, upwind from my garage, and involved significant quantities of material. Now I was really interested. Here's what most people don't understand about money laundering. It's not just about moving money through fake accounts or shell companies. When you're dealing with large amounts of cash from illegal sources, you have physical problems to solve. Bills from drug operations are often marked, tracked, or contaminated. Serial numbers need to be obscured or removed. Large quantities of small bills need to be exchanged for larger denominations. And all of this processing creates chemical residues, metal particles, and other trace evidence that can be detected with the right equipment. If Celine was running a cash processing operation in her house, maybe in that basement with the elaborate wine cellar she'd mentioned at neighborhood parties, my stone-cutting equipment would be creating vibrations that could interfere with delicate chemical processes. Worse, the noise might attract attention from neighbors who could overhear conversations or activities that were supposed to remain secret. Suddenly, her determination to get rid of me made perfect sense. This wasn't about HOA rules or property values. This was about protecting a criminal enterprise that was probably worth millions of dollars. But now I faced a dilemma. If I was right about Celine's activities, I was potentially dealing with dangerous people who had a lot to lose. Going to the police with suspicions based on metal filings and fake service vehicles wouldn't be enough for a search warrant, but it might be enough to get me killed if the wrong people found out I was investigating. I needed more evidence, but I also needed to be smart about how I got it. The answer came to me while I was testifying in court the following week on an unrelated case. The defense attorney was questioning my analysis of trace evidence, trying to establish that microscopic particles couldn't provide reliable information about criminal activity. Isn't it true, Mr. Cavallari, that these traces could have come from any number of innocent sources? No, I explained, because we don't just identify the presence of materials. We analyzed distribution patterns, concentration levels, and chemical signatures to determine the most likely source and activity that produced them. That's when it hit me. I didn't need to spy on Celine directly. I could analyze the environmental evidence that her activities were leaving behind and build a case based on scientific data that would hold up in court. I started collecting air and soil samples from around my property, focusing on areas downwind from Celine's house. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of routine environmental testing that any homeowner might do if they were concerned about contamination. What I found over the next month was a textbook case of chemical money laundering operations. Soil samples from my backyard showed elevated levels of acetone, methyl ethyl ketone, and toluene, solvents commonly used to remove inks and coatings from currency. Air samples taken near my garage detected trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide and sodium hypochlorite in concentrations that suggested nearby chemical processing. Most damning of all, I found microscopic paper fibers in my air filtration system that matched the composition of U.S. currency paper, the kind of fibers you'd only find if someone was mechanically processing large quantities of bills. But the real breakthrough came when I analyzed the metallic contamination in more detail. The brass particles weren't random. They showed specific wear patterns consistent with currency sorting machines, and they contained traces of ink formulations used exclusively by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Someone was definitely processing stolen or marked currency in large quantities using industrial equipment somewhere very close to my house. And the timing of the contamination spikes corresponded perfectly with the service visits I'd been documenting at Celine's house. By mid-June, I had enough evidence to convince any reasonable prosecutor that serious financial crimes were being committed in my neighborhood. But I also had a more immediate problem. The HOA had escalated their campaign against me to the point where I was facing daily fines, legal threats, and increasing pressure from neighbors who were starting to believe I was some kind of dangerous nuisance. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday morning when I found a cease and desist order taped to my garage door. Celine's attorney, a downtown firm that specialized in business litigation, was demanding immediate compliance with all HOA directives and threatening to seek an injunction that would force me to remove all equipment and pay accumulated fines totaling over $8,000. They were also threatening to put a lien on my house for the unpaid fines, which could force a sale if I couldn't pay immediately. The letter gave me 72 hours to comply or face escalated legal action and potential criminal charges for violation of community covenants. Criminal charges for sculpting stone in my own garage. That's when I realized Celine wasn't just trying to shut me down anymore. She was trying to destroy me financially and legally, probably to set an example for any other neighbors who might think about causing problems for her operation. Time to stop playing defense. I spent that afternoon putting together everything I'd collected over the past 3 months. Photographs of fake service vehicles, chemical analysis reports, trace evidence documentation, patterns of suspicious activity, and financial records showing the coordinated legal pressure campaign against me. Then I made some phone calls. The first call was to Detective Maria Santos in the Financial Crimes Unit, someone I'd worked with on several cases involving money laundering and organized crime. I didn't give her details over the phone, just asked if she could meet me for coffee to discuss a potential financial crime situation in my neighborhood. The second call was to Agent Jennifer Park with the FBI's Charlotte Field Office. The Bureau has jurisdiction over large-scale money laundering operations, especially ones that might be connected to interstate drug trafficking. I'd provided expert testimony for several of their cases, so she knew my work and reputation. The third call was to my friend Tom Rodriguez at the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN. Tom specialized in tracking currency flows and identifying cash processing operations. If anyone could make sense of the chemical evidence I'd collected, it would be him. I arranged to meet all three of them that Friday at my house, ostensibly for a neighborhood barbecue, but actually to show them what I'd discovered and get their professional opinions on how to proceed. Here's something most people don't realize. Law enforcement officers are actually pretty social when they're off duty. We see the worst of humanity at work, so we tend to stick together and appreciate normal, boring activities like neighborhood barbecues and backyard conversations. What my neighbors saw that Friday evening was just Ryan having some friends over for burgers and beer. What was actually happening was a multi-agency consultation on one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations any of us had ever encountered. Detective Santos took one look at my chemical analysis data and whistled low. "Ryan, this is not small-time stuff. Someone's processing serious money here, probably connected to major drug distribution networks." Agent Park was more interested in the fake service companies and interstate vehicle registrations. These patterns match operations we've been tracking in Atlanta and Miami. If this is connected to what we think it might be, we're talking about $50 to $100 million in annual cash processing. Tom from FinCEN was fascinated by the currency fiber evidence. I've seen similar contamination patterns at sites where cartels were operating industrial-scale bill processing facilities. The chemical signatures suggest they're not just cleaning money, they're manufacturing counterfeit documents and possibly producing distribution-ready packages for resale. All three of them agreed on two things. First, this was way bigger than a neighborhood HOA dispute, and second, I was potentially in serious danger if Celine's organization realized how much I'd figured out. The good news, Agent Park told me while we stood around my grill pretending to discuss marinades, is that you've done most of our investigative work for us. The evidence you've collected is solid, professional grade, and admissible in court. The bad news, Detective Santos added, is that people who run operations like this tend to solve their problems permanently when they feel threatened. You need to be very careful about how you handle the HOA situation until we can get surveillance set up and start building a federal case. Tom had the most practical advice. Don't change your routine. Don't let on that you know anything. And for God's sake, don't try to collect any more evidence on your own. We'll take it from here, but we need you to act normal while we put together a task force and get judicial approval for electronic surveillance. That night, after my friends left, I sat in my kitchen trying to process what I'd learned. My stone sculpting hobby had accidentally uncovered what was probably the largest money laundering operation in Charlotte's history, and the woman who was trying to destroy my life was apparently connected to major drug cartels and organized crime networks. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Because for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I wasn't just a victim trying to defend myself against HOA harassment. I was a forensic expert who'd identified a major criminal operation, and I had the full resources of federal law enforcement backing me up. Celine Harrison had picked the wrong neighbor to fuck with. The federal task force moved quickly once they had my evidence to work with. Within 2 weeks, they had court orders for electronic surveillance, financial record subpoenas, and authorization to intercept communications at Celine's property. My role was to act completely normal while they gathered additional evidence and identified all the players in her organization. That meant continuing to deal with the HOA harassment, paying the accumulating fines, and pretending to be worried about the legal threats. It was harder than you might think. Every time Celine smiled at me during neighborhood encounters, every time she made another move to pressure me legally or financially, I had to remind myself that federal agents were watching and recording everything she did. The breakthrough came in mid-July when Treasury agents identified large cash deposits at 3 different banks that corresponded with the service visits I'd been documenting. Celine's organization wasn't just processing dirty money, they were integrating it into legitimate financial institutions through a network of shell companies and fake business accounts. Agent Park called me at work with an update that made my day. We've identified at least 12 people involved in this operation, including 2 bank executives, a city inspector, and someone in the district attorney's office. Your neighbor isn't just laundering drug money, she's running a corruption network that's been operating for at least 5 years. What's the timeline for arrests? We're planning coordinated raids for next month, but we need to be careful about the timing. Some of these people have connections that could tip them off if we move too early. What about the HOA situation? They're threatening to foreclose on my house for unpaid fines. Keep playing along for now. Pay the minimum to avoid foreclosure, but don't give them any reason to think you're backing down completely. We need Celine to feel confident that her pressure campaign is working. The waiting was brutal. Every day brought new harassment from the HOA, additional fines, threats of legal action, pressure on my neighbors to file formal complaints. Celine had recruited 2 other board members to her cause, and they were making life miserable for anyone who publicly supported me. Dr. Peterson got cited for a non-conforming mailbox that had been in place for 3 years. The Johnsons received a violation notice for excessive garden ornaments, the birdbath I'd carved for them. Mrs. Chen down the street was fined for parking her car improperly in her own driveway. The message was clear: support Ryan Cavallari, and the HOA will find reasons to make your life difficult too. But federal surveillance was revealing the true scope of Celine's operation, and it was staggering. She wasn't just laundering money for one criminal organization, she was running a service business that cleaned cash for multiple drug cartels, organized crime families, and corrupt political networks across the Southeast. The home maintenance visits I'd been documenting were actually cash pickup and delivery runs. Dirty money came in through landscaping trucks and cleaning services. Clean money went out through fake repair companies and medical equipment suppliers. The whole operation was generating an estimated $200 million in cleaned currency annually, with Celine's organization taking a 5% fee for their services. Her basement wasn't just a cash processing facility, it was the regional hub for one of the largest money laundering networks in the United States, and my stone cutting equipment had been interfering with their operations for months. creating vibrations that affected delicate chemical processes and generating noise that made it difficult to conduct secure communications. Tom from FinCEN explained it during one of our discreet check-ins. Industrial money laundering requires precise environmental controls. Temperature, humidity, air circulation, vibration dampening. Any disruption can ruin batches worth millions of dollars. Your workshop wasn't just annoying her, it was costing her organization serious money. Agent Park had an even more interesting revelation. We've been monitoring her communications, and she's been taking heat from her suppliers about the delays and processing problems. Apparently, some very dangerous people have been questioning her ability to maintain operational security. In other words, my hobby had been creating problems for Celine with criminal organizations that solved their problems through violence. No wonder she was so determined to get rid of me. By early August, the task force had enough evidence to proceed with arrests, but they wanted to coordinate the raids with seizures of cash processing facilities in 3 other states. The operation had grown into a multi-agency investigation involving the FBI, DEA, Treasury Department, and local law enforcement in 6 different jurisdictions. I was told to expect significant law enforcement activity in my neighborhood within the next 2 weeks and to make sure I was somewhere safe when it happened. But Celine made one final move that almost derailed everything. On August 12th, I came home from work to find police cars in my driveway and Detective Williams from the local sheriff's department waiting by my front door. He looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic. "Mr. Cavallari, I need to talk to you about some allegations that have been made." My heart sank. Had someone tipped off Celine about the federal investigation? Was she trying to discredit me before the arrests happened? What kind of allegations? "We received a complaint that you've been conducting unauthorized surveillance of your neighbors, specifically taking photographs of private property and vehicles without permission. There's also a suggestion that you might be using your position with the police department to access confidential information for personal use." Celine's final gambit. She couldn't get rid of me through the HOA, so she was trying to get me fired and arrested for misconduct. Detective Williams handed me a formal complaint filed by 3 residents of Willow Creek Reserve, alleging that I had been stalking neighbors, photographing their property, and using police databases to investigate people in my neighborhood. The complaint requested a full internal affairs investigation and possible criminal charges for abuse of office. "I have to ask you to surrender your service weapon and badge pending the outcome of the investigation," Williams said. "I'm sorry, Ryan. I know this is bullshit, but internal affairs has to follow protocol when there are allegations involving use of department resources. I was suspended without pay, under investigation for stalking and misconduct and facing potential criminal charges, all based on complaints filed by the same woman who was running a $200 million money laundering operation 50 feet from my bedroom window. The irony was almost funny. Almost. I called Agent Park immediately after Williams left, and she was furious. This is exactly what we were worried about. Celine's trying to neutralize you as a witness before we can make arrests. Can you intervene? Tell Internal Affairs this is part of a federal investigation? Not without blowing our operation, but we're going to accelerate the timeline. Raids are happening tomorrow night, whether we're completely ready or not." That evening, I sat in my garage with a beer and looked at the stone sculpture I'd been working on for the past 6 months, a memorial piece for the families of victims in an unsolved serial murder case. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was being investigated for stalking, the woman next door was operating a criminal enterprise that probably had blood on its money. But I'd learned something important over the past year of fighting with Celine Harrison. Sometimes the good guys do win, but only if they're smart enough to use the system instead of fighting against it. And tomorrow night, the system was going to land on Celine like a ton of marble. The raids began at 5:47 a.m. on August 14th with simultaneous operations in Charlotte, Atlanta, Miami, and New Orleans. From my kitchen window, I watched a convoy of black SUVs and unmarked police cars surround Celine's house while federal agents in tactical gear deployed around the property. The whole thing was over in about 20 minutes. Celine was led out in handcuffs along with 2 other people I didn't recognize. Behind them came a stream of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence, computer equipment, and industrial-sized bags that probably contained cash counting machines and chemical processing equipment. By 7 a.m., the spectacle had attracted news crews, curious neighbors, and at least 3 helicopters circling overhead. My quiet little neighborhood had become the center of what the reporters were calling the largest money laundering bust in North Carolina history. Agent Park stopped by my house around noon with an update that made my year. We seized $12 million in cash, arrested 14 people in 4 states, and identified bank accounts containing another $50 million in laundered funds. Your evidence was crucial to breaking the whole thing open. What about the HOA situation? Celine won't be in a position to cause problems for anyone for the next 20 to 30 years. and the complaint she filed against you yesterday is going to disappear very quietly once Internal Affairs realizes you were providing intelligence for a federal investigation. Detective Santos showed up an hour later with even better news. The DA wants to meet with you about testifying in the federal case. Apparently, your forensic analysis is going to be a key piece of evidence showing how the money laundering operation worked. What about my suspension? What suspension? According to the paperwork I just filed, you've been on temporary assignment with the federal task force since July. Your captain is very impressed with your undercover work. Tom from FinCEN had the most satisfying update of all. We traced the money flows back to their sources, and it looks like Celine's organization was cleaning cash for some very serious people. Drug cartels, arms dealers, human traffickers, the worst of the worst. You didn't just bust a money launderer, Ryan. You helped cut off funding for some truly evil operations. That evening, I fired up my wet saw for the first time in weeks and got back to work on the memorial sculpture. The sound echoed through my garage and probably carried across the neighborhood, but nobody was going to complain about it anymore. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the Willow Creek Reserve Homeowners Association, signed by Interim President Williams, officially rescinding all fines, violations, and restrictions related to my workshop activities. The letter also included an apology for any inconvenience caused by the previous administration's overzealous enforcement of community guidelines. Williams stopped by that weekend with a bottle of bourbon and a story that filled in some of the gaps in my understanding of what had been happening. Celine had been pressuring the board for months to take a harder line on non-conforming activities, he told me while we sat on my back porch. She always had these detailed complaints and legal research to back up whatever position she wanted to take. Did you suspect anything? Not about the money laundering, but something felt off about her obsession with your workshop. She was spending way too much time and energy on what should have been a minor noise issue. When she started bringing in lawyers and threatening liens, I knew we were dealing with something personal rather than legitimate HOA business. Why didn't you say anything? Williams laughed ruefully. Because she controlled the finances and had dirt on half the people in the neighborhood. Anyone who crossed her seemed to develop problems with code enforcement, tax assessments, or mysterious complaints to their employers. I figured she was just a control freak with too much time on her hands. What kind of dirt? Financial stuff, mostly. She had access to bank records through her old job and wasn't shy about using that information to pressure people. Dr. Peterson's mortgage application contained some creative income reporting. The Johnsons had some undeclared rental income from their vacation property. Mrs. Chen was claiming a disability tax credit she probably wasn't entitled to. So she was blackmailing people? Nothing that obvious, but she had a way of mentioning these things during board meetings when she wanted support for her positions. I'm sure Dr. Peterson agrees that we need to be more careful about tax compliance given his expertise in financial planning. That sort of thing. I was starting to understand why nobody had been willing to stand up to Celine directly. She'd created a system of mutual assured destruction where crossing her meant having your own secrets exposed. The FBI asked me to testify about her methods, Williams continued. Apparently, the intimidation and blackmail are part of the federal charges, using extortion to maintain operational security for a criminal enterprise. What's the neighborhood going to do now? Get back to being a normal place where people live instead of a cover operation for organized crime? We're dissolving the current HOA board and starting over with new bylaws that prevent any one person from having too much control. He raised his bourbon glass in a toast. Here's to stone sculpting and catching bad guys. I could drink to that. The federal trial began in March of the following year, and I spent 3 days on the witness stand explaining how environmental forensics had uncovered a massive money laundering operation. The prosecutor walked the jury through my analysis of chemical residues, trace evidence, and contamination patterns, showing how scientific investigation had revealed criminal activity that might otherwise have gone undetected for years. Celine's defense team tried to portray me as a vindictive neighbor who had fabricated evidence to get revenge for HOA disputes, but the scientific data was overwhelming. You can't fake chemical signatures or manufacture trace evidence that matches specific industrial processes. More importantly, the federal agents who'd built the case using my initial findings testified about the scope of the operation they'd uncovered. 12 separate criminal organizations across 6 states, $200 million in laundered currency annually, connections to drug trafficking, arms dealing, and human smuggling networks that stretched from Mexico to Canada. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Celine Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. 14 other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The judge made a point of commending my investigative work during the sentencing hearing. Mr. Cavallari's diligent attention to detail and scientific expertise helped expose a criminal conspiracy that had evaded detection for years, he said. His courage in pursuing the truth despite personal harassment and legal threats exemplifies the best traditions of law enforcement. After the trial, I received a commendation from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and a Civilian Service Award from the FBI. More importantly, I got my life back. The memorial sculpture I'd been working on during the investigation was completed and installed at the courthouse, honoring the victims of violent crime and their families. It includes a small heart carved into the base where only I can see it, my tribute to Emma and my reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there's always the possibility of creating something beautiful. The Willow Creek Reserve neighborhood has returned to being what it was supposed to be, a quiet place where people live normal lives without fear of harassment or intimidation. The new HOA board operates with transparency and accountability, focusing on actual community issues instead of serving as a front for criminal enterprises. Dr. Peterson commissioned a sculpture for his medical practice. The Johnsons asked me to create a memorial garden piece for their parents. Mrs. Chen wants something for her backyard that incorporates traditional Chinese design elements. My workshop runs 7 days a week now, and nobody complains about the noise. But here's the most satisfying part of this whole story. Last month, I received a letter from a detective in Miami who'd read about the Celine Harrison case and wanted my help with a similar situation. Apparently, someone in his neighborhood had been complaining about industrial activities that turned out to be covering for a drug distribution network. "Would you be willing to consult on this case?" he asked. "We could use someone with your expertise in environmental forensics and money laundering investigations." "I'm considering it. Turns out there's a real demand for forensic experts who understand how criminal organizations operate and how to identify them through scientific analysis of their environmental impact. Maybe I'll start a consulting business, Cavallari Forensic Services, specializing in neighborhood crime detection. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? The stone sculpting will always be my first love, my therapy, my way of creating beauty in a world that often seems determined to destroy it. But using my professional skills to help other communities identify and eliminate criminal operations that hide behind legitimate institutions? That feels like a natural extension of everything I've learned about justice, perseverance, and the importance of fighting back when someone tries to destroy what you care about. Celine Harrison thought she could intimidate me into silence by using the HOA rules and legal system to make my life miserable. What she didn't understand was that people who work in forensic investigation for a living are professionally paranoid, scientifically trained, and absolutely relentless when it comes to uncovering the truth. She picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. And the beautiful irony is that her criminal operation was ultimately brought down by the very activity she was trying to eliminate. My stone-cutting equipment didn't just interfere with her money laundering processes, it provided the trace evidence that led to her arrest, conviction, and 25-year prison sentence. Sometimes justice really is poetic. 6 months after the trial ended, I was working in my garage on a commission piece, a fountain sculpture for a local bank, which seemed appropriately symbolic. When my phone rang, the caller ID showed Agent Park's number. "Ryan, I've got something you'll find interesting. Remember how we traced some of Celine's operation back to connections in other states? Yeah, the multi-jurisdictional stuff that led to arrests in Miami and Atlanta. Well, it turns out the network was bigger than we thought. We've identified similar operations in 12 different cities, all using the same model, corrupt HOA officials providing cover for money laundering activities in upscale residential neighborhoods. I set down my chisel and gave her my full attention. How similar? Nearly identical. Financial crimes expert gets elected to HOA board, uses association powers to control neighbor activities, eliminates any potential witnesses or threats through harassment and legal pressure. We think Celine's organization was franchising their methods to criminal groups in other markets. That's actually brilliant. Evil, but brilliant. The problem is that most of these operations are probably still active. Local law enforcement doesn't have the resources or expertise to investigate financial crimes hidden behind HOA disputes, and federal agencies only get involved when someone provides enough evidence to justify a major investigation. I could see where this was going. You want me to help identify these operations. I want to offer you a position as a consultant with the Financial Crimes Task Force, full federal credentials, access to investigative resources, and a mandate to help local law enforcement agencies identify and investigate suspected money laundering operations in residential communities. The offer was tempting, really tempting, but I had to ask the obvious question. What about my job with Charlotte-Mecklenburg PD? They're willing to loan you to the federal task force on a rotating basis. You'd work major cases with us while maintaining your position and seniority with the local department. Best of both worlds. I looked around my workshop at the marble dust coating every surface, the half-finished sculptures waiting for attention, the peaceful chaos of creative work that had saved my sanity and my life. Then I thought about other neighborhoods where people like Celine Harrison were probably using their positions to protect criminal enterprises while terrorizing honest residents who just wanted to live their lives in peace. "When do I start?" Agent Park laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a situation in Raleigh that we'd like you to look at. HOA president with a banking background, multiple complaints about a resident who restores vintage cars in his garage, and some interesting patterns in the association's financial records." Vintage cars? Classic muscle cars. Apparently, the restoration work involves a lot of engine noise, metal grinding, and chemical processes for paint removal. Sound familiar? It sounded very familiar indeed. "Send me the files," I told her. "And Agent Park, this guy in Raleigh, if he's anything like Celine, he's not going to know what hit him. Because here's what I've learned from this whole experience. Criminals who hide behind legitimate institutions think they're untouchable because they understand how to manipulate legal systems and bureaucratic processes. What they don't understand is that forensic science doesn't care about their social status, political connections, or legal maneuvering. Evidence is evidence. Crime is crime. And sooner or later, the truth comes out. My name is Ryan Cavallari. I'm a forensic expert, a stone sculptor, and apparently a specialist in identifying criminal operations that masquerade as neighborhood disputes. And if you're running a money laundering operation behind an HOA complaint about noise violations, you should probably find a new line of work. Because I'm just getting started. The stone dust floating in the afternoon sunlight looks different now that I know what to watch for. Not just the normal granite and marble particles from my sculpting work, but the subtle traces that might indicate criminal activity nearby. Chemical residues that don't belong, metal contamination that suggests currency processing, environmental signatures that reveal activities people are trying to hide. Over the past 3 years, I've helped federal task forces investigate 17 similar operations across the Southeast. Turns out Celine's network was just the beginning. There's an entire shadow economy of financial crimes hidden behind HOA disputes, neighborhood complaints, and suburban respectability. The vintage car restoration enthusiast in Raleigh was being harassed by an HOA treasurer who was running a cryptocurrency laundering operation for international arms dealers. The excessive garden maintenance complaint in Savannah led to uncovering a human trafficking network that was using landscaping companies to move victims between safe houses. The noise violation case in Birmingham revealed a counterfeiting operation that was producing fake identification documents for criminal organizations across 3 states. In every case, the pattern was the same. Criminal enterprises using residential communities as cover, corrupt HOA officials eliminating potential witnesses through legal harassment, and honest residents being terrorized for activities that posed no actual threat to anyone. My consulting work with the federal task force has become so successful that I've had to cut back on my sculpture commissions, though I still maintain my workshop and continue creating memorial pieces for crime victims' families. There's something poetic about using the same skills and equipment that helped expose Celine's operation to create art that honors the people harmed by criminal organizations like hers. The memorial sculpture for Emma sits in my backyard now, where I can see it from my kitchen window every morning. She would have been 14 this year, probably arguing with me about curfews and asking for a car. Instead, she's carved in white marble, forever 8 years old, forever perfect, forever the reason I learned to create beauty in response to tragedy. Dr. Peterson still stops by sometimes to watch me work. The Johnsons moved to Florida, but sent me a Christmas card with a photo of the bird bath I carved for them, surrounded by flowers in their new garden. Mrs. Chen's traditional Chinese dragon sculpture has become something of a neighborhood landmark, drawing visitors who want to see the craftsmanship and hear the story behind it. The new HOA board operates with transparency and accountability that would make government ethics committees jealous. Monthly financial reports, recorded meetings, open communication with residents about any concerns or complaints. They've even established a neighborhood watch program that's actually focused on crime prevention instead of petty harassment. Williams is still the president, and he's turned out to be exactly the kind of leader the community needed. Fair, practical, focused on genuine issues rather than power games or personal vendettas. Under his leadership, Willow Creek Reserve has become the kind of neighborhood where people actually want to live instead of a cover operation for organized crime. But the most satisfying development has been watching property values recover and rise as news of the criminal investigation faded, and buyers realized they were getting a chance to live in a community that had been thoroughly cleaned up by federal law enforcement. Nothing says safe neighborhood quite like a recent FBI raid that eliminated all the actual criminals. Last month, I got a call from a detective in Seattle who'd heard about my consulting work and wanted help with a particularly complex case. An HOA in an upscale suburb was systematically targeting residents who worked from home, claiming their business activities violated community guidelines. The pattern of complaints and legal pressure was familiar, but the criminal activity they were covering seemed to involve cybercrime rather than traditional money laundering. "We think they're running a call center operation that specializes in elder fraud and identity theft," the detective explained. "The work-from-home complaints are targeting people whose legitimate business activities might interfere with phone operations or attract attention to unusual electronic activity in the neighborhood." I accepted the case immediately. Cybercrime targeting elderly victims? That's exactly the kind of evil that deserves to be exposed and destroyed. The investigation is still ongoing, but preliminary evidence suggests we're dealing with an operation that's stolen over $40 million from retirees across the western United States. The HOA complaints about home offices and commercial internet usage were designed to eliminate residents who might notice the unusual patterns of electronic communications or question why so many telemarketing companies were operating out of suburban homes. But here's the thing about criminals who think they're smart enough to hide behind legitimate institutions. They always underestimate the people they're trying to intimidate. They see a stone sculptor and assume he's just an artist who won't fight back. They see a vintage car enthusiast and figure he's just a hobbyist who'll cave under legal pressure. They see a work-from-home consultant and think she's just someone who can be bullied into submission. What they don't see is that many of us have professional skills, investigative training, and access to resources that can uncover criminal activity no matter how cleverly it's disguised. They don't realize that harassment campaigns often create exactly the kind of motivated, knowledgeable adversaries who are most dangerous to criminal enterprises. They pick the wrong neighbors to mess with. All of us. And the network of federal agents, local detectives, forensic experts, and specialized consultants that's grown out of these investigations is getting very good at identifying and dismantling criminal operations that hide behind suburban respectability. So if you're reading this and you're dealing with HOA harassment that seems disproportionate to whatever violation they're claiming, if you're facing legal pressure that doesn't make sense for the scope of the problem, if you're being targeted by community officials who seem obsessed with eliminating activities that pose no genuine threat to anyone, maybe it's time to start asking some deeper questions. What are they really trying to hide? What kind of activities require the kind of environmental control and operational security that would be threatened by your perfectly legal hobby or business? What are they so afraid of that they're willing to risk this level of exposure and legal liability to get rid of you? And if you need help finding those answers, if you need someone who understands both criminal investigation techniques and the science of environmental forensics, if you need an expert who's spent the past 3 years specializing in exactly this kind of situation, you know how to reach me, because there are more Celine Harrisons out there, more criminal enterprises hiding behind community guidelines and homeowner association rules, more honest people being terrorized by criminals who think their legitimate activities pose a threat to illegal operations. But there are also more people like me now, people who've learned to recognize the patterns, gather the evidence, and use the system to fight back against corruption that masquerades as respectability. The stone sculpting taught me patience, precision, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw material. The forensic work taught me to see patterns that others miss, gather evidence that holds up in court, and never stop pursuing the truth no matter how well it's hidden. And the combination of those skills has turned out to be exactly what's needed to fight a type of crime that most people never realize exists until they become targets themselves. My name is Ryan Cavallari. I turn stone into art and evidence into justice. And if you're running a criminal operation behind HOA complaints, you should know that I'm very good at both. If you've made it this far, I want to know, what would you do if you found yourself in Ryan's situation? Have you ever dealt with HOA harassment that seemed way out of proportion to the supposed violation? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I want to understand how common these kinds of problems really are, and if you enjoyed this story, there are more like it coming. Next week, I'll be sharing the case of the Seattle cybercrime investigation and how a retired software engineer used her technical expertise to expose an elder fraud operation that was hiding behind complaints about excessive internet usage in her neighborhood. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's exposing the truth and watching justice handle the rest.